Inigo Montoya, who, if you ever seen a famous film adaptation of The Princess Bride, you know becomes essentially our secondary hero of the entire piece. Or perhaps, depending on your reading, he is the central hero. We'll get to that in a few moments. But first, like I said, let's review. So when we last checked in at the beginning of chapter 5, we understood that Prince Humperdinck needed a wife. But he was more interested in finding a wife so that he could produce an heir for the country of Florin. Now, Florin, of course, is traditionally at odds with their neighbor, Guilder. In fact, there's a famous stream that runs between the two countries, and depending on which country you're from, the stream is named for that country. It's either the Guilder Strait, if you're from Guilder, or the Florin Strait, from Florin. So Humperdinck, of course, a little bit of an egoist. He wants a very beautiful bride, someone who he believes best suits his station as a prince. And he determines that that person is going to be Buttercup. After all, she is a servant of his kingdom, and she doesn't really have the right to deny him the request to marry him. But she does anyway. And he says, well, you know, why would you deny me that opportunity and deny yourself the opportunity to be the wealthiest, most powerful woman in Florin? And she says, well, you know, I don't excel well at love. And he says, oh, love? You think this is a matter of love? It's not. This is a matter of necessity. And this is more like a business transaction than a romantic venture. And she says, well, as long as I don't have to be in love with you, I would rather be wealthy and beautiful and give away turkeys at Christmas than be violently executed. And Prince Humperdinck readily agrees to this. And so she is named as the Princess of Hammersmith, so that she can get around all the legal rigmarole involved with the prince not marrying a commoner. However, after 3 years of tutelage in the courtly manners and the ways of the aristocracy, she's actually developed a bit of her own mind. And she has developed some unique ideas of her own about being a ruler. But the man in black who watches the presentation of the Princess Bride to the people of Florin has his own agenda and ideas as well. And we're told that he is ominously watching from the farthest tower at the farthest point of the castle as Buttercup makes her first public appearance. We find out, though, that this entire idea, marrying a princess to produce a male heir, is not really what Humperdinck has in mind. The key for him is to attack Guilder because he believes that war would be more profitable and more to his liking. Remember that he is a hunter first and foremost, and that the hawk-like sensations that he experiences are driving him toward war because it's a pastime that he feels he would excel at. So in order to instigate war with Guilder, he plans to have Buttercup murdered and to have her body planted on the Guilder frontier so that he will finally have justification for going to war with them. To accomplish this end and to wash his hands of the business altogether, he hires 3 kidnappers who are distinctly or respectively referred to as the Spaniard, the Turk, and the Sicilian. Or, as we know them in their cartoon forms here from left to right, Inigo, Fezzik, and Vizzini. So in chapter 5, the villains have scaled the cliffs of insanity. And I say villains with a question mark, right? The mastermind, the Sicilian known as Vizzini, explains that it's most likely that their pursuer, the man in black, is first a local fisherman out for a midnight swim or troll in shark infested waters. And that once they scale the cliffs of insanity and they see him following, Vizzini orders that the rope be cut so that he will plummet to his death. However, the man in black is a little bit more persistent and he does not fall to his death. Instead, he grasps on to the cliff face and begins to slowly ascend, climbing with his bare hands. So, as the man in black does a free solo out on the cliffs of insanity, Vizzini comes to a more logical conclusion, which is that it is most likely that he is not a sailor who also enjoys mountain climbing, because any other explanation would be inconceivable. At this point, Inigo's character comes to the foray, and his true character comes to the fore, and he says that I don't think that word means anything. He keeps using that. And this is not an inconceivable situation. We are clearly being pursued here. However, since Fezzik's strength is necessary to transport Buttercup closer to Gilder, the task of stopping the man in black falls to the man who first realizes that he's not just a happenstance character, that he is actively pursuing them. And that, of course, is Inigo. So in this chapter, which is subtitled, or the subchapter, I guess, which is titled Inigo, we find out that he was raised poor but happy by his very humble father, Domingo Montoya, in the mountains of Arabella, Spain. Now, this is a beautiful image because the mountains of Arabella, Spain are described as very clear and pristine, and it's a very romantic sounding place. We learn that Domingo was described as funny looking, crotchety, and impatient, absent minded, and it says here never smiled. But Inigo still loves him, and he does so unconditionally. Now, we are also given information that reveals Inigo's father was a sword maker. And this all begins to tie together to the earlier appearances or descriptions of Inigo, who is described as having very vast and broad scars on both sides of his face. And he himself is so thin or emaciated that he's described as blade thin. So Montoya, Domingo Montoya, the father, is a swordsmaker, but he does not like to deal with the public. He's one of those classical pairings, or he's part of those classical pairings of folks who are in the background and actually do the work, and the pitchmen who get all of the attention. A really good example would be Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was the near genius who actually designed all of the software and put together a lot of the hardware for the early Apple computers, where Steve Jobs is vastly remembered because he was the idea man. He was the guy who sold the product. So in this case, we have another such duo. We have the figure of Yeste, who is the salesman. He presents himself as the famous sword maker. And certainly Yeste can make swords himself, but if it's a special order and it has to be done perfectly and the pay is really good, he travels up the mountain to visit Domingo because Domingo is the one with the exquisite skills. And that introduces two important tropes into the discussion of this novel: the figure of the father and the figure of this mythical sword maker, who is represented by both of whom are represented by Domingo Montoya, the father of Inigo. The father here is connecting to the mythical structure, the romantic structure of the novel, but it also connects to the reader and the process by which this story is uniquely told. I think a very obvious connection is the one between Goldman and his own father in the description of what it was like to share time with him, having a story read to him, and being the audience of that reading. So Goldman's father is a figure here, the narrator of the original telling of the story that we're reading now. So things kind of all trace back to him. And if you look at the structure of the story, it's very interesting to note that at a certain point, everything really traces back, or all of these series of events trace back to Inigo's father. That's right. They trace back to Domingo, because if Domingo had taken or not taken the request of Count Rugen, or Tyrone, we actually learn his name in chapter 5, his first name is Tyrone Rugen. If he had refused to take the commission from Tyrone Rugen, he would never have died. Or if he had dueled with Tyrone Rugen and won, Tyrone Rugen would never have met Buttercup. Tyrone Rugen would be dead, and Humperdinck would never have found out that she existed. And the lives that she and Wesley and everyone else connected to the story would have been completely different. But in many ways, you can find the match that sort of strikes the chord leading to all of the events that is the novel The Princess Bride directly back to Domingo Montoya. And I think that's something that Goldman is hoping that we will connect for ourselves in the reading. The figure of a father in literary studies is someone who provides a sense of security, but also helps the hero establish their identity, and is often the touchstone character that begins the hero's quest. Fathers are very critical to the way in which characters define themselves. And this is specifically true of how male characters define themselves in literature, but it's important to note that this is also true for many female characters. And in particular, Shakespeare, who was also the father of many young daughters, was very interested in the relationships between daughters and fathers, much as his principal fan, Queen Elizabeth, was understandably interested in the relationship between fathers and daughters. So we see, at least in American literature, a tradition that goes back to the classical era, and at least as far back as Shakespeare, to this connection and prevalence of the father as a key figure in our psychological well-being, and specifically in the development of characters, and heroic and characters, male and female alike. It's for this reason that James Earl Jones is both Darth Vader and Mufasa. Right? He has that sense of commanding tone, the voice. He is this father figure. Now, Vader, of course, is German for father. So if you were to have spoken German and you had someone named Darth Vader, or Vader as we pronounce it in English, you probably had a clue that Darth Vader was going to be someone's father at some point or another. Just as Mufasa is a character that transcends time and even life, as he appears to young Simba to redirect him on his course to claim his true lineage as the rightful heir to the jungle, so to speak. This is also the same reason why Cobra Kai has resonated with so many fans as of lately. We have multiple examples of fathers and good and bad templates for fathers within the course of this television series. Going back to the original Karate Kid, we see the somewhat abusive father-son relationship between Johnny Lawrence and his sensei, Reese. And then we see Johnny in Cobra Kai step into a father role for Miguel. And he tries to do a better job than Kreese did with him. And yet we have another dimension with Johnny's own son rejecting him in favor of the tutelage of his old nemesis, Daniel Russo, the titular Karate Kid. So we have a lot of Shakespearean almost elements percolating in the background of even new shows. These traditional narratives and these traditional narrative elements continuing to crop up time and time again. But perhaps it's, I think Shakespeare does it best when he also explores the father dynamic with women. Of course, over here on the left, you've got a version of King Lear. And if you've never read King Lear, it's about a aged monarch who has 3 daughters. And he wills his kingdom to be divided equally amongst his 3 daughters. And their choices in life and for significant others ultimately lead his kingdom to ruin. It's interesting to watch how this entire process evolves. Because, of course, traditionally, despite a father's relationship with his daughter and the degree of love he might feel for a female child, it wasn't until, probably the late 19th or earliest 20th century, and specifically first here in America, where women became elevated to something beyond a traditional dowry price, right? If you had money and a daughter, you were probably going to be able to secure a better agreement for yourself, better terms, so to speak. But we see the same sort of dynamic operating in Romeo and Juliet as well. Up until Romeo slays Tybalt, there is a sense that Juliet and her father see life in equal terms. Juliet really does have her father wrapped around her finger until Romeo creates a situation that even he cannot allow. His nephew is killed, and they demand, or society demands, action, demands some sense of satisfaction for that. And as such, he must, for the first time, deny his daughter something that she really, really wants. And it's something tragic, because it's the relationship between two families that could, again, broker peace. But the relationships between fathers and daughters are always a little bit more complicated in life and in literary terms. So I raise a question for you. What do you think? Inigo specifically seems to find himself driven by revenge, and he even says as much to the man in black once he reaches the top of the cliffs of insanity. But I'm not sure that we would think of his quest as one of revenge versus one of love. He cared about his father and the fact that he was killed maliciously by Count Rugen. is enough to put anybody on a path to right that wrong. But is it actually love, or is it truly revenge that's driving his motivations? And that touched off another host of questions in my mind. Do the roles of characters like Inigo and Fezzik strike a different chord with us as readers than, say, someone like Vizzini because they had loving but perhaps difficult parents? In fact, I would ask you to gauge relationships with between children and parents like Fezzik and Inigo against relationships like Humperdinck and his father Lotharin. If their relationships are different, then why is that? It's a curious question, maybe something for debate. And let's just pause to think and reflect for a minute about the characters who have no father, or about whose fathers we know little to nothing. Count Tyrone Rugen, we don't know about him or any of his relationships. He does have a wife, that's about it. Wesley didn't have a father, he was a foundling. Vizzini, he probably obviously has a parent, but he doesn't know him in the same sense that several of these other characters do. Whereas we also know several characters who distinctly do have a father. Buttercup's father is someone that she first sees in her early development, who tends to be at odds with her mother. Humperdinck has a father, and a father who seems to think very highly of him, but his relationship to the father is dubious at best because he doesn't know too much about why he is motivated to do the things he does. And there's a bit of a mystery as to the king's health also. Fezzik has a very difficult relationship with his father, one that's based on, I guess I would say, more traditional expectations of male behavior. But ultimately, his father and his mother help him to overcome various social difficulties that he encounters due to his size and strength at an early age. And of course, in this sub-chapter with Inigo, we learn a lot about Domingo Montoya and the love that he felt for his son. And that was a conditional and unconditional love that transcended things like the absence of a mother or the relative degree of poverty that they found themselves in. Now, the other aspect of Domingo Montoya that we have to talk about is that of the mythic sword maker. And in popular culture, one of the most latest tropes, or one of the most latest, hold on, Mr. Powell, one of the latest tropes that we've encountered in literature or cinema would be Hattori Hanzo from Kill Bill. Now, interestingly, he was based on a real person, sometimes called the Demon Samurai. And his exploits of legend may very well be responsible for why Western audiences sometimes conflate and confuse the ideas of a traditional samurai and a ninja. He was both a trained and well-versed samurai, but would use ninja-like techniques and attacks to get the job done. He was kind of a Ronin samurai. He had no specific master, but rather was available to whoever could pay his fee. And he's utilized in the framework of the Kill Bill storyline as a representative of someone whose work was well known. He could craft that magical material that went into honing a perfect and deadly blade. Now, whether we're talking about Hattori Hanzo or Merlin the Magician or Darth Vader constructing his own lightsaber, we're talking about someone who is valued for creating an art. And for Domingo Montoya, that's the six-fingered sword. And I think there's a wonderful connection here between the idea of writing and the idea of creating a sword or being a craftsman. Because at some point, Count Rugen returns to, and again, I have to give it to William Goldman. He creates a lot of wonderful tension. We know the six-finger sword exists. We know it's wonderful because Domingo Montoya already brandishes it before the battle on the top of the Cliffs of Insanity. But the blade itself and its construction is fraught and is carried out over the course of 5 or 6 pages, just the development and design of the sword. And by the time that we've read all of that, we as readers are kind of psychologically invested in the process of what it took to craft that sword. And of course, Count Rugen returns to retrieve the sword, having made a down payment of a single gold piece. And Domingo asks, I believe, for 10 gold pieces. And Count Rugen says, well, it's great, but it's not that great. I'll give you 5 plus the one I already paid on down payment. And this is insulting because a lot of his life, a lot of his experience and energy has been poured into the creation of the sword. Much like in the same way that an author's work is poured into the creation of a novel. There's a craft to the process. And when a publisher or a reviewer skewers that, it's tough on someone who's spent that much time and energy creating something unique and impressive. So to be told that such a creation is not worth the work, obviously Domingo is insulted. And he says, you're right, it's worth nothing. Here, even have the gold piece, the down payment back. And Rugen says, well, no, that's not what I mean. I want the sword. I obviously commissioned it to be created. I have 6 fingers. So the dimensions, the size, the balance, the weight, all of these really delicate considerations are appreciated. I still want the sword. I just don't think, the creation of it is worth as much as you claim it to be. But this is, of course, too much of an insult for Domingo Montoya. And as a result, he insults Count Rugen, and Count Rugen counters that insult by slashing him through the heart with his own sword. Obviously, Domingo attempts to avenge his father right away, but he is too young and inexperienced. And he is flatly and easily beaten in a duel with Count Rugen, who leaves him with an embarrassing reminder of his failure. 2 deep slashes on either side of his face, which he carries into his adulthood. The result, though, is that he begins a quest for vengeance. He begins to use the 6-fingered sword, and he studies. He becomes a fencer of great repute until he is a master. He trains, and then he trains some more. And we learn about his training and his search for Count Rugen over the many years that have passed since he became the perfect swordsman. However, he ultimately cannot find Count Rugen. He can't fulfill that sense of revenge. So he turns to alcohol. And that's when Vizzini finds him and brings him into his employment. So we have this additional trope with Domingo Montoya of the weapons master. There has always been in literary circles a suggestion that there's a mystical quality that's lent to a maker of weapons because he or she can craft those instruments and invest them with a sense of power. They're usually tied to the heroes themselves and invest that weapon not only with power, but with almost something akin to sentience. It's typically the weapon in most literary examples that calls to the hero. It's not the other way around. Excalibur calls to Arthur. His father's lightsaber calls to Luke Skywalker. The Hanzo blade calls out to the bride. She needs one of those types of swords to invest her revenge. You know? So does the six-fingered sword call to Inigo in some way, shape, or form? I would argue that it does. Even though he is not the one for who it was created, he is the one the sword chooses to be its owner, if you can handle that idea. And of course, this section wraps up with a duel. But how can you spend so much time and invest so much energy in a character like Inigo Montoya and then have him lose? Well, obviously the man in black is fighting for love. He fights to rescue Buttercup and save her from death, whereas Inigo, in this instance at least, has lost his way along his path and is only battling for money without honor. In some ways, you might suggest that the sword, again, if you can believe in this idea of sentience for an inanimate object, perhaps the sword does not believe it is fighting for the right purpose. And of course, there's also the figure or the condition that both men are fighting at the beginning with their left hands because they wouldn't want to make it worse on the other fellow. So in this battle without honor, we return to a selection from Kill Bill. So this was written by Quentin Tarantino, but it's often, I think, humorously attributed to Hattori Hanzo. And it's directly from the film. But I think it applies to the circumstances of the duel on the top of the cliffs of insanity, which is that revenge is never a straight line. It's more like a forest. And like a forest, it's easy to lose one's way, to get lost, or to forget where they came in. And I love the fact that, like Tarantino's films, the novel has a wonderful tendency to move from one concept at one point in time to explain or provide background for the characters in order to give them a richer context once we return to the chain of events as they've occurred in the initial storyline or the initial timeline. It's a very cinematic technique, and it's probably not surprising that Goldman, who had at this point spent several years working in the film industry, would employ more unique or distinctive film types of techniques in crafting a literary piece, a literary work. And I think as we move forward into the future, we'll see more novels that use film techniques to describe the pace of action and to break up a more traditional narrative. Maybe that's just me, but I anticipate it. It's a theory of mine. Okay, so to wind up, the first of the kidnappers has been bested, and the man in black has proven his mettle as a student of skill. But as we move into the final portion of Chapter 5, we know he must now face the strength of Fezzik. Okay, for next week, please read, if you haven't done so already, the final portion of Chapter 5, Fezzik, for Tuesday. And don't forget to respond to this week's discussion forum. I've already had several interesting topics and responses this week. and I am going to be happy to dig into them, and I'll be responding shortly. Now, let's take a look at the persuasive essay, our second major project in this semester. Okay, so this should be pretty familiar. This is the standard English 104 composition essay rubric that you're used to seeing by this point. As you can see, the persuasive essay, it's pretty substantive. Along with the argument, it's accounting for about 22% of your overall grade. That's in contrast to the analysis, which was only a scant 6%. But you're going to be doing a lot more work for the persuasive essay, so I think that's only fair. The essay itself is going to be due at the end of the month, around the 30th of this month. So next week, this week is kind of the introduction week. Then we will have planning week, and then we will move into the development week. Okay. This time we have a little bit of a shorter window because remember that I will offer some opportunities for peer revision, but I won't be revising this essay. So this is kind of a one-time and finished activity. Now, you will have an opportunity to revise either this paper or the argumentative essay, worth another 22%, later in the semester. So you'll have to make a choice as to which revision number 2, you want to complete for your final project for this semester. It'll be worth 100 points. Like I said, a little bit more work, so the point scale has gone up incrementally. It will be tasked at 850 words or more. You can always write a little bit more if the spirit strikes you, which is roughly equivalent to 4 pages. Notice that I've highlighted the tilde here. It's closer to 3.5 pages, but the college asks us as faculty to use or focus on the number of words because we have agreements with several other area colleges, including NIU, and they also focus on word count as opposed to page length. So when I make an estimate, I'm using a piece of software available online, and you can do this too. It's just called Words to Pages Converter. And when I put in 850 words, it says 3.5 pages. So make of that what you will. The format is typically the same as per usual. However, this time you're going to need at least 2 authoritative sources that you can use as evidence to help establish your position. Now I'm going to create a survey sample where our librarian, Mrs. Webina, walks us through the research process. If you've already taken 103 with me, you probably know how to proceed from here without watching that video. But I will reach out to her. I know she's really busy at this time of the year. But I want to reach out to her to see if she can provide us with any additional incentives or information regarding the research process. So we'll be doing that sometime next week. I'm not sure if it's going to be Tuesday or Thursday. I have to schedule an appointment with her to see when she's available or if she's available. But even if she isn't, I will take some time to make sure that I cover at least some basic search parameters. You will need 2 authoritative sources to use as evidence to help establish your position, to convince your readers of your perspective. But what is it you're actually asking them to consider? Well, realistically, You can ask them to consider any argument. You can try to persuade them to take on your position for any related topic that has come up in relationship to our text, The Princess Bride. But I do have a couple of suggestions that I want to run by you in case you're completely, in the dark. Okay, obviously the paper is going to charge you with, quote, influencing an audience to adopt a particular belief or to follow a specific course of action. That definition comes to us from our principal text, Practical Argument by Kersner and Mandel. Now, persuading your reader of a particular position about some of the larger issues and themes that we've been discussing this semester is going to require you to reflect on the rhetorical situation to find the best appeal for a specific audience. You may wish to reflect on the following possible topics originating in our discussions about and around The Princess Bride. So some of these we've already talked about in great detail in the weekly discussion forums. Goldman, in his parenthetical asides to readers, refers to Morgenstern as a satirist and the unabridged version of The Princess Bride as a satire. Webster's dictionary defines satire as a usually topical literary composition, holding up human or individual vices, folly, abuses, or shortcomings to censure by means of ridicule, derision, burlesque, irony, or other methods, sometimes with an intent to bring about improvement. So going by that definition, is the Good Parts version of The Princess Bride a satire? Well, if you agree and you think it is, explain why and what it is that's being satirized. If you take a different position and you think, well, I don't really view this as a satire, then how would you define the type of book or genre of book that this is? You might also want to think about Goldman himself, and this is one of those questions that we've been asked to consider in the discussion forums. So it's repeating here, but if that was something that piqued your interest and now you want to pursue that in a broader format, you could ask yourself, does Goldman present himself as a sympathetic character? How does he describe his relationships with his wife, his son, and his father? How are those relationships reflective of his virtues and his faults? Do you think he portrays his actual wife, son, father, or are they also fictionalized characters? That last question can be easily addressed with just a little bit of research on William Goldman. Thirdly, should writers draw a firm line between fact and fiction? If a writer puts him or herself into the story, do they have a moral obligation to be truthful about themselves, or are they free to treat themselves and any other real-life person similarly inserted into the text as a fictional character? This is a pretty straightforward way of thinking about a question. I think this may be the easiest of the sample questions, and I wouldn't be surprised if a number of students gravitate toward this one, because the research to support this is very open to interpretation, and you could find some pretty good stuff by casting your net real widely. Is Goldman's portrayal of Buttercup misogynistic? Number 4. I think this will also be a popular one. It may require you to do a little bit of reading ahead or researching that will spoil some of the later context of the novel for you, but not too badly. Is there a pattern to the way women are portrayed in The Princess Bride, ranging from the starlet Sandy Sterling to Goldman's psychoanalyst wife Helen, and even extending to Valerie, the wife of Miracle Max? That's an idea that's rife for discussion, and I could see good arguments being made for this belief that his portrayal is misogynistic, and I could see some hardy defenses of being generated along the terms of these questions. You could defend Goldman's portrayal. I could see that happening as just as easily as I could see someone agreeing that it is, in point of fact, misogynistic in certain ways. Lastly, Count Rugen is certainly a sadist, and Prince Humperdinck seems to be so as well. But beyond that, other characters display submissive or even masochistic types of behaviors, as for example, when Wesley repeatedly replies, "as you wish," to Buttercup's petty commands earlier in the novel. So how do these strains of sadism and masochism color the portrayal of true love as it exists in the text of The Princess Bride? So those are the, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 prompts that I was able to come up with. But of course, as most of you know, who have had me for 103, I'm going to add another prompt that you're probably used to seeing, which is just this. You may design your own topic for exploration regarding The Princess Bride. And of course, we'll italicize this because it is the title of a work of literature. Please submit a essay prompt description of 3 to 5 sentences via email for me to approve. We'll say review and or approve. For this project. Okay, so you do have a 6th option, which of course is to take up anything that you wish. Now, my heart kind of broke the other day when a student contacted me and asked about a really great paper topic that he wanted to propose. But it was along the lines of a more political topic. I can't remember the exact parameters, but the emphasis for this class, of course, is writing. And that can include writing in politics, writing in all sorts of various genres. But I have to confess, I am not the world's most studied person when it comes to politics. I don't really feel comfortable evaluating political papers for a literary class. I think that that would be an excellent topic for a poli-sci class, or for someone, a professor even, who had a little bit more of a background in psychology or political science. I don't. I have a background in literature and film. Hence, a piece of literature with a famous film adaptation. But as our text suggests, arguments occur in all realms, in every stage of life. So if you feel like you're going to do a better job with a paper, I'm of two minds about it. At one point, I have to consider your peer reviewers, because if the majority of the peer reviewers go along with my ideas and write papers about The Princess Bride, I think that they'll be confused if they see a paper about, the current political debates or something like that. So I think you'd be safest to stick with material related to The Princess Bride. If any of these ideas really float your boat, or you're like, yeah, I was thinking about those questions as I read the book, or this occurred to me, as a feeling I experienced when I was writing, then perfect. You don't have to really expand too much. This will be right up your alley. But if you're just not digging the book and you're lost and you're like, you don't really understand, or you are feeling a true lack of motivation about writing in regard to this text, email me and we'll see if we can strike some kind of compromise. Maybe there's a way for you to talk about a topic that you're interested in in a persuasive manner that would allow you to make some sort of allusion or comparison to something that's going on in the book. Maybe you could compare political leaders of today with the political agenda of someone like Prince Humperdinck. I know that's kind of out there, and I'm asking you to cast your net in a wide way in order just to accommodate the teaching of this text. But that's an option at least we can talk about. I don't want to cut anybody off, especially if the chances are good that you could create a really good persuasive essay if you're allowed to have a little bit more leeway. So now you have a lot of different options to think about over the weekend once you've seen this video and completed the discussion questions for this week. Okay, that's it for today's session. Thank you so much for your time and your attention today. I look forward to hearing from you in the discussion forums, and I am curious to see what you all come up with in terms of original topics or just topics that you think that you might want to visit as part and parcel of completing this essay project. Well, until next time, this is Mr. Fowler bidding you a wonderful rest of your week. Take care, everyone.